author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Donald Trump claims a win in the New Hampshire GOP primary against former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. This comes hot on the heels of his Iowa victory, where he won the caucus by a record-breaking amount. What does this mean for the overall GOP primary? What does this mean for Donald Trump and Nikki Haley? And of course, the people who've already dropped out of the race. And possibly most importantly, what does this mean for the 2024 election that is now more than ever looking certain to be between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll be speaking with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, on all things related to the primaries. We'll also be talking with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott D. Cosenza, on Georgia taking Trump to task, courtesy of Fulton County DA Fani Willis. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. For all the ins, outs, the ramifications, the thoughts and the fears of the latest GOP primary, we're joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Timothy Donner, with his new featuring Tim Donner logo in the background, which I love dearly.
Thank you for drawing attention to that. No, that was not my idea, by the way.
For those of you listening,
name up in lights. That was somebody else's notion.
For those of you who are just listening on the radio here on Radio America Network, there's a big gold microphone with almost flames coming out of it. It's rather Old Testament. So Tim, thanks for being here. Obviously, the topic today is the Republican primary and caucus situation and how that affects politics going forward. Now, we're recording this just after Donald Trump won New Hampshire, and what I would say is a fairly decisive victory. What do you think, Tim?
I'd say it's borderline decisive because, as I wrote on the pages of LibertyNation.com, it's reasonable to say that if she had reduced her margin against Trump down to single digits, it would have been a clear victory of sorts, where she could claim that she beat expectations, which is really all she could realistically hope for. But she didn't do that, but she wasn't like at 15 or 20% deficit. So I think 11% is legitimate to say that you can move on. The problem for her is not New Hampshire, even though that was one state that she really had to win, in the sense that you don't get another state that is as sort of purple as New Hampshire.
If I could just interrupt you there, Tim. Isn't that fascinating that we're saying that about Nikki Haley, that she needs a state that's purple to win?
Well, yes, because look, in fairness, though, I think we need to put this whole thing about her neoconservatism into perspective. She gets the purple vote because she's not Donald Trump, because there's a lot of people that simply will not vote for Donald Trump, won't consider voting for Donald Trump. So she's the repository for the collective vote of those people. That doesn't necessarily mean that she's automatically the war hawk that everybody says she is.
Sure.
I don't think we know that. In fairness to her, I also think that it's time we give some credit where it's due. This woman has outlasted 8 male candidates of stature, and she's still standing. She's looking good. She's sounding good. She is a shrewd politician. And I think what's in front of her now is to decide, because she's got a month before South Carolina, with only Nevada in between, which she can probably brush off.
I want to talk about Nevada briefly, but we'll do it after.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
Well, I'll just finish about South Carolina. Of course, it's her home state, which would lead you to believe, oh boy, no wonder she's excited about going to the state that she governed, and quite successfully and quite popularly, I might add, governing as essentially a mainstream conservative. It's a matter of if she believes one of two things. The first thing would be, look, Trump's going to win this. I can see the handwriting on the wall like everybody else, so I'm going to do a graceful exit and endorse him. But maybe I'll campaign another week or two just to see if I get any traction and then pull out. If not, it seems to me option number two for Haley is to stay in right through Super Tuesday, because Trump's first trial is scheduled to begin the day before Super Tuesday. And number two, I don't think anybody in the Republican Party is totally comfortable with the idea that Donald Trump is not going to drop in the polls if he gets convicted or is seen constantly in court. So as a shrewd politician, what she's doing now, is it worth the risk to sort of further divide the party by taking her fight all the way to March? Or is she better off accepting defeat here, knowing that she'll look magnanimous and be in a very good position for 2028?
Yeah, it occurs that might be her best scenario now. Now, if there were other people still in the race, for example, Ron DeSantis or even a Chris Christie, for example, then holding out to see if essentially betting on if Trump gets sent to prison is I guess the base way of looking at it, and then she would semi-automatically get the nomination or get the nod anyway. But yeah, by being the only other candidate in the field, that kind of puts her in that position, because the others are now, in that respect, proven quitters, right?
Well, there's also another plan that could be in place.
Yeah.
There's a great deal of value to the second spot on the Republican presidential ticket this year. As if Trump wins, then the vice president, whoever that is ideally positioned to be the default frontrunner for 2028. The strategy could be to keep pushing to prove that she can attract the people in the party that don't like Trump, almost forcing him to take her as his VP, because he's already proven that he's looking at the VP position as he did in 2016, not as a reward for one of his rivals, so much as a shrewd political decision that increases his chances of winning. And I think that undeniably Nikki Haley would add to the tick, even if she loses some support, because she's seen as an old-time Bush-style neoconservative. But if the goal is to unite the party, the anti-Trump people won't have a whole lot left to say if he picks Nikki Haley.
Interesting contention. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Now, earlier in the show, we were just talking about Trump's victory, how this impacts Nikki Haley's possibilities for a VP pick, and various other things. But I'd really like to dive into the electoral math here, Tim. Now, but at one point that I did want to come back to was Nevada is before the South Carolina election. Now, Nikki Haley, she said in her, I guess you'd call it a victory speech, even though she came second. You'd call it a victory speech because she wasn't demolished by the numbers.
Mark, it shows you how shrewd a politician she is, because she picked the optimal time of the evening when she had a deficit of only about 7 points.
Yeah.
Go out on stage and say, hey, look how close I've come on to South Carolina. That's very clever. instead of
It is.
waiting till later in the night.
Yeah.
And of course, she congratulated Trump, but she got on stage long before him and at a time of the evening where she was guaranteed to get more coverage. This is a shrewd politician.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think she's proven that by outlasting all these other men.
Yeah, I think so. It was really clever that she knew that it was going the one direction. She thought, well, if I get there now, this video will be my one speech that everybody looks on, and it's at a point where it's not a terrible victory. It shows that I've made a good gain. Now, the reality was that gain sort of slackened to almost twice what it was, I guess, when
Although
she made
her
the speech.
I do observe that her outfit looked like she had come from a golden jubilee ball or something. It was very formal, but I'm sure there was a reason for that.
Sure. But she said in her, let's call it her quasi-victory speech, she said, yeah, we're on to South Carolina. Now, she completely missed the fact that Nevada's next.
Yes.
Okay. Now, there's a reason for that. And
Yeah.
I'm sure quite a lot of our listeners know this, but there's almost like two popes where Nevada's concerned. It's like the schism in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
So just for some
Or
background,
in the New Hampshire Democratic Party
or in the New Hampshire Democratic Party, absolutely.
with
Um,
their unsanctioned primary.
yeah, they'll get sanctioned somewhere along the lines, I tell you.
Yes, that's true.
But yeah, so what happened in 2020? Well, 2021, I guess, 2020, is both Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders demanded recounts because the system by which their votes were counted, they were not happy with it, which, just goes to show they're clearly election deniers, right? Demanding all those recounts. But
That's
that's
already
besides
been
the point.
established. Yes.
Already established. So what happened was that the Democrat state legislature changed the law on how these things would be held, and then the Republicans sued back in, I think it was May 2023, saying that Democrats are trying to control how we hold our presidential nomination system, and so you ended up with the state is now running the primaries, but the GOP state party is running
mechanism
a
is running a
caucus.
caucus,
Yeah,
which is the only place where delegates are awarded.
exactly. That's the
And
key.
and here's what Nikki Haley's going to say. Okay, she didn't register for the caucus,
Mm.
but she did for the primary, which is just a beauty contest.
Yeah,
She'll
her
get
Mike Pence in there as well.
yeah, well, she'll get crushed in the primary, but she won't lose any delegates from it. She'll spend some time trying to get some votes in the caucus,
Mm.
but she'll probably point out that Trump lost Nevada twice in 16 and 20 and try to say that she will win Nevada and therefore she should be supported by Nevada Republicans who are, and they are more moderate, I have to
Yes,
say, as
yeah.
a
Well, they're so
whole
close to
in the country.
California.
Yes,
It's a
it's
3 hour
like
flight, right?
well, the wind carries that progressivism a little bit eastward. Yeah.
Yeah, you're saying that like it's something the CDC should be looking into, carrying that progressivism on the wind
Well,
into
I
Nevada.
mean, I'm not the one that called progressivism a mind virus. I just repeat that others have said
Sad,
that.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Gad sad. If you're listening, Dr. Sad, do get in touch. So we have Nevada. Now, Trump is going to win that 100% because the only other person in that caucus is Ron DeSantis, who's withdrawn. So nobody's going to cast a vote. He gets all those delegates. Now, this is giving Trump quite a healthy lead going forward. I think he's certainly going to win South Carolina as well, by quite the margin. The polls have him, the aggregate of polls, according to 538.com, have him 50 points ahead of Nikki Haley in the Palmetto State, her hometown. So I think he's going to get the delegates there. He'll get the delegates in Nevada. He's got a pretty awesome lead then going into Super Tuesday, hasn't he? And Michigan, I'm sorry. Michigan has him 50 points ahead. He has double in South Carolina.
Look, he's got massive leads in all of these states.
Yeah.
The only real justification on paper for Nikki Haley to continue through Super Tuesday is A, what happens with the Trump trials?
Yeah.
Things could get worse for him and scare people off. And number two, on Super Tuesday, 15 states include a few that allow independents or even Democrats to vote in a Republican primary. So she hopes maybe she can pull off something like New Hampshire by attracting the non-Trump vote. And I think she's convinced, she again cleverly says, look, almost half the party says they don't want Trump. That's her spin on the fact that more than half the party does want him. But how that translates to a general election, nobody knows.
It's interesting that you bring up about the open primary systems where people, non-affiliated voters can vote in the things. But also, Trump's been talking about this as well. And the New York Times, ABC News have been saying that he's speaking false. He's talking false statements, which they seem to just apply straight off to Donald Trump.
Jeez, that's a new one.
But specifically
the New York
here,
Times, let me get this straight. You're telling me the New York Times accused Donald Trump of lying? Alert the rest of the media.
Yeah.
Alert the rest of the media.
Specifically on this one, he's talking. They were talking about when Donald Trump said that Nikki Haley is relying on, for example, Democrat infiltrators to get her vote share up in the New Hampshire primaries. Now, they're basically essentially saying that this is talking false. Nobody's doing this. Anyway, there's a group working. It's a progressive group run by a chap called, I believe it's Richard Schwartz, and he spoke to Politico. His group's called Primary Pivot. Robert Schwartz, sorry. And this is actually what his group does. They're spending $500,000, $1 million on actually getting people to change their party affiliation before the October deadline, the October that is gone. And according to him, now bear in mind he is on the left because his whole mission is to stop Donald Trump. He says it's about 3,500 Democrats that became undeclared before the October deadline, and he believes that I believe that he believes that was in order to vote against Donald Trump. And
well, know what this? Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Also, there's tens of thousands of the undeclared voters that they were convincing that they've spent $500,000 on to specifically vote against Donald Trump in the primaries. Now, I think that's why Nikki Haley did as well as she did in the New Hampshire primary. Whether that can be repeated down the line, though, I don't think that's a viable option going forward. Tim Donner, we're going to be right back with you just after this short break. Please don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation senior political analyst Tim Donner. Now, Tim, we were just talking about the what Donald Trump terms the infiltrators, those who are undeclared voters or those who have dropped their party affiliation in order to vote against Donald Trump. And you wanted to come back to me on that, didn't you?
Yes. First of all, it was actually Rush Limbaugh that first started this strategy of infiltrating the Democratic primaries back in 2008. I think he said they wanted people to vote for Hillary because Obama was leading and they wanted to stop him or something like that. But it's been followed now ever since. Right, it makes sense. And of course, there is a whole group that spent millions of dollars. We don't even know how much to make sure that Joe Biden would get more than 50%. on the write-in ballot in New Hampshire, and they succeeded. He got almost 2/3 of the vote, it appears. But what happened to the old Democrat strategy that we were told for so many months was that they wanted to keep attacking and indicting Donald Trump because they wanted to induce Republicans to nominate him because they knew they could knock him off. Okay. Now, if that's true, then what are they doing trying to promote Haley, who they have to know would definitely beat Joe Biden in November? Here's the way I look at it. I think Donald Trump can beat Joe Biden. I think Nikki Haley would beat Joe Biden. She's going to be hammering that message between now and South Carolina and probably on to Super Tuesday. But with all this leftist support for Nikki Haley, that says to me that they don't want to face Donald Trump now. Now they feel like, oh no, he's actually leading in the polls, leading in virtually all of the swing states. And now suddenly the strategy, which was just like 2016 when they said, we want to face Trump because we know we can beat him. Well, they didn't. And now they're facing the same scenario, perhaps doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on the same mistake that they made in 2016.
And here's the thing, just to carry your analogy on there, they're also facing the same Donald Trump from 2016. Now, I'm not talking about his seeming ability to be the only president not to age in office, but he's the underdog fighting against the establishment once again. 2020, he was the establishment, crippled by a coronavirus that essentially shut down the country, or let's be more clear, crippled by a lot of political decisions in response to the coronavirus that shut down the country. But now he's not. He's kind of untamed. And I think they're facing a 2016 Donald Trump. And that is I believe, a terrifying thought for them. Let's jump very quickly. So he's the front runner. He's almost certainly going to get the nomination. You mentioned earlier that his first proper trial date starts the day before Super Tuesday, so that'd be March 4th. But once he is the nominee essentially, once Nikki Haley drops out, he's the nominee, right? They don't have to wait for Milwaukee in July.
Well, they'll go through a pro forma primary in a bunch of states because they've already set them up, but nobody will pay any attention. But it'll effectively be over, and Trump will turn his attention immediately to attacking Joe Biden.
I do wonder how these cases will continue against him when he is the either official or, what was it, the office of the nominee elect. We'll call it, thanks to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The office of the nominee elect.
The non-incumbent elect. How about that one?
How do you think the cases will be able to carry on, knowing that there's a long-standing, of course, when it comes to getting Donald Trump, it appears that no traditions are sacred in this, but it would be a very, very bad look for Joe Biden for, once he's the presumptive nominee, to be the Joe Biden Department of Justice to be prosecuting Joe Biden's chief political opponent.
Well, that might be true if they hadn't already begun the prosecution. Right. But look, there's two ways this could go, sort of in a generalized sense. And you already see what's happening in Georgia. That case may get just thrown out because of the relationship between the prosecutor and the prosecuting attorney. Basically between the
Fani Willis
who hires the person, Fani Willis, to be, that's a disaster for her, for Fulton County, for Georgia, for the Democrats.
For the country, let's be fair, it really appears that she just abused her office, is what it looks like on the outside. We'll find out if that is actually true. But
it may be, there's two ways this could go. The first way is that, oh my God, look, Donald Trump's in court again, and it's going to be an endless number of trials, and I may prefer him, but it's not worth the trouble of voting for someone who may wind up in prison. That's one way it could go. The other way it could go is, okay, we've been hearing this for 8 years about the death of democracy under Donald Trump. We've been hearing that we're going to get a dictatorship. The stuff doesn't even land anymore. And all these prosecutions just prove that they can't beat him at the ballot box, so they're going to try to beat him in court. Those are the two sort of bookends of what could happen here on the legal front. But if you were the Trump legal team, there's one basic premise of your entire legal strategy. Do not get convicted before Election Day.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
it. Push everything back as far as possible.
Yeah.
Delay.
Yeah, I think that second position that you highlighted there, that people are looking at it and thinking, well, hey, they can't beat him at the ballot box. They're trying to beat him in the jury box. I think that's a very powerful one, because America is essentially, it always has been since the middle of the last century, it's been the anti-Russia. It's been the anti-communist country. There was the Red Scare, there was McCarthyism. But there's always been this, we can't be like the communist Soviet Union. We can't be like that. But in the communist Soviet Union, political opponents, off to the gulags with you, off to Siberia with you.
Yes.
And there's no way that, rightly or wrongly, with the Donald Trump prosecutions, rightly or wrongly, there's no way it doesn't look like a communist Russian tactic to a large chunk of voters. There's no way it doesn't have that optic.
And it looks like a conspiracy, even if these 4 separate sets of charges are made independent of some central Democratic National Committee personnel kind of manipulating, okay, you need to indict him here, indict him. I think a lot of people think that's true. I have no idea what sort of central planning there is around it. But I can tell you that the strategy doesn't look nearly as good now as it did maybe 6 months ago. I think the Republicans were frightened with all these charges 6 months ago. Now, I sense that the Democrats are starting to be frightened of the obvious overreach, particularly, for example, the Alvin Bragg case in New York. And all these cases are being prosecuted with novel legal theories that have never been applied to a single person before. I think that's pretty transparent, even to voters who don't like politics and aren't paying attention.
Yeah, Joe Biden might win the election. He might, his Department of Justice might win in the courts, but in the public sphere, the optics war, that is a battle long lost. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Can the case against Donald Trump in Georgia stand, given the latest revelations over Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis and her, let's call it, affairs of the heart? We're joined by Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, who happens to be Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, who has been following this story almost as closely as me, I would say. Scott, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you so much. And
Good.
It's proving to be an interesting story as the days wear on.
It is a fascinating story. And the reason I think that people are so watching this, it's almost like a soap opera that's unraveling, like 3 episodes a week or something, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays during the top Nielsen hours. It's because it was due to be the biggest case against Donald Trump, which may have been superseded by the Jack Smith DC case. But it's the one that people thought, wow, this is a person who's not part of Joe Biden's Department of Justice going after Donald Trump.
Or is she, Mark?
Or is she? Well, that's something we're going to come to.
Yeah.
And it seems that the case is unraveling the way I see it. And obviously, I am not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not any kind of lawyer. I've barely even seen 2 episodes of LA Law, Scott. I should be honest with you. And when I did, it had Harry Hamlin in it, if that gives you some idea of the timescale we're talking.
Harry Hamlin played Arnie Becker on LA Law. Which
Wow, there you go.
I think every episode of. Absolutely right.
I don't have a great understanding of American law on this, but it seems to me that she entered into the prosecution in bad faith, and that can affect how the case goes on.
No. This is there's no bad faith prosecution rule that I'm aware of, that the Constitution requires a good faith, except that if somebody perhaps violated an oath or violated a fundamental right of a defendant, well, then that's a different story altogether.
Let's delve into
the very
that.
nature. Well, let me just say this: the very nature of how prosecutions work in the United States, you could say, I mean, they could all be in bad faith, in
and some would argue that they are.
There's no but yeah, she is. You know, it's funny because her father was a Black Panther. I'm talking about Fannie Willis, the Fulton County area district attorney, the Atlanta area. It's one of these things where it's like actually crosses county lines.
Sure.
So that's why it's a little hard to precisely to.
That's
to
because if you're
way.
only in Atlanta, you only get Atlanta money, right?
Well, I think it's because they wanted to expand and access. A lot of times what happens, Mark, is they see the bedroom communities outside of the cities prosper because they're not subjected to all of the detrimental policies of the city, and then they annex that. I think that's happened in Houston and maybe in Atlanta as well. And, you know, I guess we're going down a bunny trail now, but one thing I've been reading about is how a lot of the Atlanta area citizens who are, in fact, Democrats, just to be clear, do not support Fannie Willis's continued prosecution of Donald Trump because the resources that it's sucking from the prosecution of the people in that area that need prosecuting for violating the rights and stealing the property of others. And so there's a real problem. I was reading about this influential Facebook group, I think it was, of people who had supported Fannie Willis when she was running for office, and then decided to turn her office, of course, into a national political office, which is what we're dealing with now.
Yeah, so I think, Scott, that to the layman, the issue comes up that she purposely avoided going through the process with the Fulton County overseers to appoint Nathan Wade, who she appointed to become the prosecutor in the case the day before or after he filed for divorce. So presumably Mrs. Wade, who says that Fannie Willis is a material witness in the divorce, which can pretty much only mean one thing, that she purposely avoided the scrutiny that should be and is actually in place under Georgia law to appoint Nathan Wade. When people think about this is a bad faith prosecution, you're right, there is no legal standard for it's a bad faith prosecution. What they're saying is that, or what they're thinking, what I'm thinking, or how it seems to me is probably a better way to put this. If it seems that if there wasn't a material benefit to her personally, now whether that's through winning political office again or higher office, or through obviously having money spent on her allegedly having money spent on her by the person she appointed with all these trips away, that she may not have pushed for the prosecution as hard. And I think that's the looking glass through which people see this.
There's a word in British English that doesn't really exist in American English, which is campaigner. And as I understand it, a campaigner, as you folks use it over there, is a person who advocates for or protests for a certain cause or action. Is that
that is correct? I wasn't aware that wasn't an American.
We don't use the word. We don't use the word campaign.
Okay.
A campaign is a thing. A politician may campaign,
right,
or other people may campaign for a politician, but protesters and advocates, we don't say are campaigners. But I, Mark, have long been a campaigner for a rule adoption in the United States that says that district attorneys and prosecutors should forego and be forbidden by law from running for office, because I think that they are all is wrong. They often and so many use their offices, their prosecutorial offices, to advance their quest for political power. And I think it's despicable, and it's often walking on the backs of criminal defendants. And it's important, I think, and the power to prosecute and imprison should be so sacrosanct and respected that we take away that from it. So it's the very nature of prosecutions in America, Mark, where that prosecutors will use their prosecuting to advance their political well-being and quest for more power and further office. So all of those prosecutions, you could say, would be in bad faith. It's sort of endemic and by its nature. So that's why I rebuff the sort of bad faith argument about that somehow produces some sort of actionable legal reason to dismiss the indictment, for instance.
And this is why we have experts on the show. Thank you, Scott. Now, so Scott, how will this go, do you think? What are the various permutations of an outcome here?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about it recently. I'm not a Georgia lawyer or licensed to practice law there, but in my reading, I've learned something about the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia, and that's who, if Ms. Willis was removed from the case by the Fulton County Superior Court judge who's presiding over it, Scott McAfee, I believe is his name. He has the power to remove Ms. Willis and her office from prosecuting the case against any of the defendants because of her dalliance and extracurricular activities with Mr. Wade. If he does, that group that I just mentioned, the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia, is the one who would be responsible for appointing a new prosecutor in the case. Now, here's where things get interesting. That new prosecutor could do any number of things, including saying, I decline to prosecute this case, just by doing that. It's funny, you mentioned when we began about how Ms. Wade, or rather Ms. Willis, did not get Mr. Wade's application to be the prosecutor approved by the local board, as is the proper form. And at the time, I think we talked about it, and I thought it was a nothing burger because the revelations about her being extra personal friends with Mr. Wade were not in the public eye at that point. But now that actually seems like it could be part of the conspiracy, to basically feather her nest, to get money to Mr. Wade, to perhaps use her office for political purposes instead of justice.
It demonstrates the suggestion of intent, doesn't it? That there was an intent to pull the wool over somebody's eyes by not going through the proper channels.
You know what's funny, Mark? I also went to the Prosecuting Attorneys Council website, and for job openings, they have a job opening for what they call a conflict prosecutor, which is what this would be. In other words, there's a conflict with one of the prosecutors, so they have to install a new prosecutor. And this one asks for somebody with first chair experience in serious crimes up to and including
RICO.
Well, which would be RICO would be included. So it's funny they're asking for help in this very area. But that is one of the things that could happen. Also, the judge could rule that Ms. Willis is allowed to continue prosecuting Donald Trump, and that this impropriety, we still haven't heard from her or her office regarding these charges, with each passing day that she doesn't address them directly and deny impropriety. I think that, the skeptic in me says, well, there's there's more and more smoke. Where is the fire? It must be there. But it is possible. I think we have to lay out that it's possible that this is, not true, that she's not engaged in an inappropriate relationship with Mr. Wade or inappropriately funneling money to him as yet. These are things that have yet to be determined.
And you can keep finding out what's happening in this ongoing saga on the pages of libertynation.com. Scott DiCosenza, thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Senior Political Analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, and Legal Affairs Editor, Mr. Scott DiCosenza, Esquire. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners at home, for tuning in, week out. Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.